Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for those on the East Coast. Welcome to Thursday and our live webcast for this week. Very excited to be here again with you all today. If you are new here, my name is Molly Proct. I am your host, and I get to be joined every single week by a few of our different coaches that we have here at Aduro. And we get to touch on the different topics and areas of life that we are all going through right now to foster a feeling of connectedness and resilience and clarity for you all. And so for those, again, that are joining for the first time or maybe a bit unfamiliar, Aduro is a human performance company that exists at the intersection of well-being and performance. And among many things, we offer expert coaching and interactive content. And also we help ignite cultures and build social connections, just like we're doing here today, to promote growth for all people. So a refresher of the logistics, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen here, there are two features. There's a Q&A feature and there's also a chat feature. And we encourage you throughout the session to utilize that Q&A feature to ask us directly questions or maybe concerns that you're feeling right now, that you're kind of going through in this stage of life. And we do our best to incorporate those into the conversation if they're not already kind of built in. And then we also, as coaches, ask a lot of outward facing questions that can maybe create a little bit of clarity or spark a little new perspective for you. And so a reminder that if you do choose to chat in, which we really encourage you, chats are visible to the audience if you send it to the entire audience, which we encourage you to do, just to build that sense of community and relatability, while the questions that you submit are only visible to the panelists. So with that, short and sweet, I am so excited to be able to introduce you my guest for today. You see her beautiful face here on the screen. She is one of Aduro's on-site coaches in Des Moines, Iowa. Adelie, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yay, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk.
Yes, I am too. And so you're probably more excited about this. I'm more nervous about this today. And for our conversation around vulnerability, I am somewhere in between really excited to dive into the topic today and also feeling like I want to completely avert stage left and avoid vulnerability at all costs. And so, Adelie, when we connected earlier this week and we were talking about, what are we going to bring forward for the audience today, you kept on kind of touching on this idea of toxic positivity. And so let's start off just by articulating what is the term toxic positivity and how does it relate to being vulnerable?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So to me, this idea of toxic positivity is really this culture of portraying yourself as being happy no matter what. So really rejecting those negative or uncomfortable emotions and, putting on that mask, putting on that brave face, pretending to be happy or okay, instead of being open and honest with yourself about what you're actually feeling and accepting those emotions, whether they are happy or sad or mad or fearful. And I think that's where vulnerability comes in. Vulnerability is really about embracing those emotions and accepting those emotions. And when we find ourselves in this culture of toxic positivity, it really hinders vulnerability. Again, because it can be very minimizing to other people when you're minimizing your own emotions. And it can cause other people to feel guilty or isolated or ashamed for what they're experiencing. So yeah, I think that's how kind of those two play together for sure.
Yeah. And it makes me think back to our first live cast with Coach Jansen. And one of the big, powerful takeaways from that session was really connecting to your emotions and not generalizing them, but really getting clear on what are you feeling right now? And this concept of naming your emotions and having that awareness to really get clear on what it is you're feeling in order to have clarity to move forward. And it seems like from what you've shared, we as a society have this habit of generalizing negative emotions and wanting to kind of get past them really quickly. And also trying to avoid situations or experiences that may make us feel like we're an anomaly or we're different from the feeling that the collective group has or the community or our social circle. And so tapping into being vulnerable and being authentic and this sense of being real, even though it might feel a little uncomfortable, is important, because if we avoid that, it essentially robs us from being fully human, and you then rob those around you from being able to be fully human as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
And even the concept, we talked a little bit about intentionality and purpose last week. And so I imagine that being purposeful is also a big piece of being vulnerable as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you're definitely not alone in wanting to avoid emotions, right? And the hard emotions, I've done that myself. I've noticed it a lot more with those around me, even as COVID-19 started and as it continues to progress. And, I think it's for a lot of different reasons. I think, people are feeling like they need to be strong for their family and for their kids or their spouse, and they need to put on this mask or this brave face. And I can see also, this fear of judgment from others. I coached someone pretty recently that was like, what will my coworker think of me if I tell them that I'm sad and that I'm not able to focus on work 100% of the time and at the same capacity that I was? And so I think that really, it again goes back to that whole culture of toxic positivity and the fear that plays into that, and the fear that plays into us being vulnerable, because we're worried about what are other people going to think of us if we really embrace those emotions.
Yeah. And I have the tendency to resort to this avoidance. Avoidance is a big, I'm realizing, especially from the last couple of weeks of talking to everybody, like I avoid a lot of uncomfortable emotions, and I have for a long time, not just in the realm of COVID-19, but the avoidance of pain, the avoidance of negative emotions. And ultimately, when I think about being vulnerable and what vulnerability can lead to per se, it's metaphorically parallel to being dunked in a shark infested water with an open gaping wound. Man, so when we think about COVID-19 and even just my experience, personally, I feel like I've been reacting to everything in a more neutral way and portraying myself as like, I'm fine, we're fine, everything's okay, in order to help other people be fine and look at like the positive and be okay. But in reality, like I'm scared. I'm scared for what the future looks like, and for myself and for my family and for families around me that I care deeply about. And so responding to the avoidance of my emotions kind of takes away per se the underlying fear that I actually feel. And I know I'm not alone in this, and I hope I'm not an anomaly in this avoidance of vulnerability. But as we shift right now with the way that things are in the world, as we shift from this short-term fear into more of long-term uncertainty, I know a lot of people can respond with, I'm okay right now, and it could be worse. So I need to be okay. I need to be fine. And so this concept of, well, I'm not as bad as, or I'm not feeling as bad as other people might. So I need to come across as being stronger than maybe I feel inside for the greater good of other people.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be worse thing I hear a lot. And I think it's really true. While there are, a lot of worse things that could be happening right now, it doesn't invalidate what we're currently experiencing. And it doesn't mean what we're experiencing doesn't suck or isn't hard. And that we can't be upset or even, grieve that loss of normalcy. And there's it's odd that we do that comparison in our brain, but I think that's just part of human nature. I think we almost use it as like a validation for our positive emotions, or those positive emotions that we're pretending to feel when we say those things.
Mm.
Yeah.
I love how you mentioned the word validation, because I feel like oftentimes when we're looking at being vulnerable, we reciprocate our vulnerability based on who we're talking to, right? Based on the relationship that we're in. And if they're, we'll kind of match their level of vulnerability, and how open or authentic are they allows us to be open and authentic. And really what this does is, instead of having this really meaningful, connected relationship and communicating to listen, right? Listen for what's kind of coming forward in the side of the relationship. It encourages us to basically be in a relationship for validation, for self-validation. So I think that validation piece is really important, because whether you are able to recognize certain emotions or certain feelings that you have right now, and how maybe you've sucked those back, or you've kind of held those back, or maybe you've portrayed them in a different way with the closest people around you. Notice this element of validation. And are you seeking validation from others to be normal, or are you able to ground yourself in who you are and seek validation from yourself?
Yeah. And I think that's a great checkpoint, even for the people, that are listening in live. Like, where do you fall on this spectrum? Like, do you feel like, you've been able to express exactly what you've been feeling, the ups, the downs, the happy, the sad, the anger, the frustration? Like, have you been able to uh, say those things out loud to someone? Or are you falling on that spectrum that's, I'm fine, I'm okay, everything's good, it could be worse? I think that's good to think about and evaluate where you are on that.
Absolutely. And I encourage, this is a beautiful part of the conversation, everybody listening on the line, if you're comfortable, again, chat in and let us know, like just what Adelie mentioned, there's a spectrum here. And how comfortable are you in sharing what you're feeling with the closest people around you? And even recognizing, like, do you have a really close, emotionally connected relationship with someone that you feel able to express these things? So as we kind of go through here, please chat in. And again, if we can chat to the entire audience, it helps us all feel like we're in this together and that we're not alone. So like, how are you feeling right now? Do you feel like you've been able to be vulnerable with certain trusting people in your life? Or do you feel like there's actually an opportunity to have a little bit more deeper, intimate conversation about what's really going on? And Adelie, as we allow the audience to chat in here, I think that's a perfect segue into this concept of, you don't need to be vulnerable with everybody, and not every single part, right? The barista at the coffee stand, though I think a lot of people have really intimate relationships with their barista. I know I do. But you don't need to kind of bare your soul and heart with everyone, right? Like you can really identify who does create this sense of psychological safety for you to be really comfortable being vulnerable.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's important to identify those people that, you have some type of trust and safety with when you're kind of practicing being vulnerable, and making sure that, those people are, again, going to hold that space for you.
Absolutely. We have some incredible chats coming in, and I know that not everybody can see them, but a lot of people are saying, hey, being vulnerable is hard. And it feels like I need this permission to be vulnerable. Thank you for sharing that, Mackenzie. Another one says, I'm closest with my kids, so we have let each other know when we are lonely and scared, and that we do video chats. That is wonderful. I feel a pressure, mostly from myself, to bring a lot of positivity and laughter to those who are close to me, and also people I don't know. But I also feel like that's me, and that is genuine and authentic to who I am. It's certainly not how I feel all the time, though, so it's definitely a balance for me. Thank you for sharing. Vulnerability is personal, it's very specific. Absolutely. Just kind of like we're chatting, right now, is being mindful and thoughtful about who you do feel comfortable sharing this part of how you're feeling with? This is a really common one. I cannot tell you how many times I've told people I am fine. I am fine. How are you? Fine. I feel like that is such a common response that indicates there is something more behind there. There is something more behind the layers. And that is a beautiful example, I would imagine, Natalie, of this concept of toxic positivity, right?
Yep.
And so be
Absolutely.
thinking of like what, and inside of the comfortable, vulnerable relationships, what triggers you to automatically shield things with fine. I'm fine.
I love
Mm-hmm.
that someone brought up uh, that note about vulnerability is hard and it's scary and it's uncomfortable. And I think that's totally true. It takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable. It takes courage to admit that we're not perfect, that we're human. It goes against really human nature,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I love that someone said that. One of my favorite authors, Brene Brown, she's very popular. I'm sure a lot of people on the line have heard of her, but she says that vulnerability is the birthplace of joy, creativity, belonging, and love. And so, as much as it is scary to be vulnerable, I think for that reason in itself is why we should be embracing vulnerability, right? To create those deeper connections, to get that joy, to get that creativity, to feel that sense of belonging and connection with the people around us.
Absolutely. And it ties into Sue, you mentioned, I keep thinking I should move on from the negative feelings, but I feel frustrated with not being able to. And what a powerful awareness for you, Sue, to recognize that what you want in terms of the doing is conflicting with how you're feeling in terms of your being. And going back to naming that emotion and really being honest with yourself of how you're feeling, and possibly maybe moving on is not necessarily what you're needing right now in terms of your being. This is so great. This is so great. And I encourage everybody to reference the chats. There are a lot of chats that are coming to us panelists individually, but there's also some that are coming to the entire audience. But just know, for those of you that can't see, vulnerability is hard and it's scary. And that is the kind of the definition of vulnerability. And it's hard, it's scary. That's why we have a difficult time doing it, especially in the right now when there's heightened emotions everywhere. We're in this time that doesn't look normal. And I love the I love the memes or the communications on social media. Like, normal wasn't ever normal. Like, we never had a normal. And what is normal, essentially, but really noticing that the elevated emotions are really heightened right now. And I think that doesn't necessarily serve us to be fully vulnerable with our communities right now if we think or feel differently than the masses.
Mm-hmm.
And really kind of grounding yourself in how you feel and being comfortable with how you feel and talking about how you feel is important. And so, in this acknowledgement of toxic positivity, although it may be really prevalent in communities right now, I know that all of us, I'm sure, can identify a time before COVID-19 that we have avoided vulnerability in certain situations or experiences. And I love that we're talking about this right now, because I feel, for me personally, struggling with vulnerability, even with the closest people in my life, is something that I struggle with often. And so, Adelie, you've done a lot of work in this area in your own life and have grown so much in this area. And so, why should we brave this perceived risk, right? This fear and the uncertainty of what may come, what may be reciprocated if we do become very vulnerable? Why is it important to lean into this and be authentic to who we are and how we're feeling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. While it does take work, like you mentioned, I didn't one day just wake up and, was suddenly vulnerable. It's a conscious decision, really, that I try to make every single day, and really being real and acknowledging and accepting, how I'm feeling, putting a name to that, like Jansen had mentioned. And really, it takes this willingness to be uncomfortable and to be real with ourselves. And again, vulnerability providing that joy and that creativity. But the other cool thing is that the awesome thing about being vulnerable and being authentic is that it's contagious.
Mhm.
I don't know if people on the line know someone that's really living in their truth and living in their gifts and their strengths and their uniqueness, but it's contagious. It's something that we want when we see that others have it. And when you're living authentically and when you are vulnerable and yourself, you give permission to those around you to do the same. And that creates some pretty incredible relationships and some really awesome friendships.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I encourage, people listening on the line, who is that person that or maybe that you admire or you model after, that is living this life of authenticity and, perhaps classified as vulnerability, that you do strive to be like, or to, like I mentioned, model after. And I love how you bring that forward, is when we are able to be vulnerable, we actually are living a life actually on purpose, and we are living true to who we are. And we no longer are kind of putting on this shield or this persona of who we think we need to be for other people. And some of us, and myself included, I have called myself a chameleon in the past, to where I will put on these different facades depending on the community or the people that I'm around. And yes, there is some true authenticness in that, but it also does shift for me, based on the emotions or the like-mindedness of the people around. And sometimes that can be really emotionally taxing, and it can be exhausting to make sure that you're fitting in, per se, with those around you, right?
Yeah, I think when you are working on becoming more vulnerable, I absolutely think it's very emotionally draining. I think, you know, really living in who you are meant to be versus who you think you should be in those different groups of people can be absolutely draining. And I think, that's one thing to be aware of as you do start to work on this area in your life and setting boundaries, like someone mentioned in the chat, and being more vulnerable, is where can you set aside some self-care time to get back some of that energy and some feel refreshed, so that when you are continuing this journey and this process, because it is a journey, right? We're not, again, just suddenly vulnerable one day, but how can I refill my cup after I've been starting to work on this?
Yeah, yeah. And I think you can identify that both sides of the vulnerability spectrum takes kind of emotional presence and emotional work. And when you do put yourself out there with the close kind of confidants and share what's really going on, that's an emotional experience. And also when you're putting on this mask or hiding behind the barrier of what you're really feeling is emotional. So by nature, like, there's some emotion and some mentally taxing elements to being vulnerable. But at the end of the day, it's being able to just show up authentically in who you really are. And as we wind down here, Adelie, mind blowing that we've already spent 25 minutes on this, on talking about this. But as we kind of look to wind down, and we've touched on the importance of being authentic for ourselves. And I know, for me and my family, I'm always trying to encourage those around me, and especially kids and my daughter, and close family, friends, children, to be authentic and be vulnerable too, and show up how you truly are. And so how can we start to bring this concept that we work on ourselves, that we will be working on ourselves, into the relationships to assist others in being vulnerable as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first step in becoming more vulnerable is really just building that awareness around, where you currently are. Where do you sit on the spectrum? Um, what are you feeling in that moment? And we talk about this in general coaching around lots of topics, but in order to change anything, you really have to be aware of where you currently are. So sitting in that, finding that awareness of where you currently are, and then thinking about, like, where do you want to be? Like, is vulnerability something that you want? Is this growth to be a better person, to live an authentic life, something that you want? And it goes back when we talk about supporting others, is really just remembering the why is vulnerability important? It's important because we want, our souls crave that deep, meaningful connection with others. We crave a fulfilling life. And in order to have those connections with people, there has to be some foundation and some basis of vulnerability. And the other thing with that is, too, that we don't want to minimize the experiences of those around us or isolate others. And so when we're vulnerable, again, it creates that space and that opportunity for others to be vulnerable with us. And our emotions are communicating something to us, right? Like, whether we're sad or happy, if we're sad, it tells someone that maybe we want a hug, or that maybe we want some comfort. Or if we're happy, it's oh my gosh, it's like maybe a celebration, or we're smiling. And so I think being more aware of our emotions and where we are helps us communicate better with those around us also.
Mm. You nailed it perfectly in my head, is that we're emotionally connected human beings, and we have to have those relationships and those connections to feel a sense of a sense of humanness. And you mentioned, like, in order to help other people be vulnerable and authentic, you have to be vulnerable and authentic yourself. And even though that may feel really hard to do, remember that things are reciprocal, right? How you show up to a relationship typically is mirrored back. And so the reciprocal element of to get vulnerability from others, we have to share our vulnerability with them, I think, is a really beautiful way to kind of tie that little bow on it. And whether that, I think, is with whoever in your life, but whether it's an adult, whether it's an adolescent or a child, it's all relevant. It's all relevant for everyone. So we want to kind of wrap up today with allowing you the time to think about, who in your life do you feel a sense of connection with, and a sense of safety with, kind of psychological, emotional safety, that you feel you can start to practice this art of vulnerability with. And again, feel free to chat it in. You don't need to share names by any means, but maybe just be thinking about it in your head around, who is it that you feel a sense of connectedness at this point that you can start to increase your vulnerability with, and feel this sense of authenticity. So we are at time. I'm going to check the chats or the questions, and it doesn't look like we have any questions for the day. If you have a question, chat it in quickly and we'll connect on it. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Adelie, thank you for sharing this uncomfortable but is incredibly important concept with us and process. And we hope that this was valuable for you. I'm excited to hear from all of you on what comes forward with this art of practice. So thank you, everyone. We hope that you join us next Thursday. We have an exciting sessions coming up for the next couple of weeks. So take care, be well, and we will see you next week.